By now, everyone knows of the docuseries Making a Murderer on Netflix and has some sort of opinion on whether or not Steven Avery had anything to do with the death of Teresa Halbach. But if Steven Avery didn't kill Teresa, what could have really happened to her? My name is Tim, and this is So You Want Me to Believe.
This is So You Want Me to Believe, the podcast for true crime.
Well, there was blood all over. She'd pulled herself right around the room, trying to find a way out, presumably.
The paranormal.
Surveillance cameras in an elevator at that hotel captured Lamb's last moments. She appeared to be acting quite erratically.
Weird history.
September 19, 1961, Betty, while driving with her husband Barney, was heading south from Canada.
I noticed a bright light in the sky, and I thought I was discovering a new planet until it started to move.
And conspiracy theories.
That flu vaccine that the elderly, the most susceptible to COVID, contained 4 different strains of influenza.
Real stories. Real people. What will you believe?
I have to assume anyone listening to the show is at least somewhat familiar with the Teresa Halbach case because of the nature of my content. But if you're not, I'll give you a brief rundown of the case as well as make a friendly suggestion that you sublease that rock you've been living under and find a more suitable living space. In 2005, Steven Avery was released from prison after having served 18 years for a crime that he did not commit. He was serving a 32-year sentence for the rape of a young woman in 1985 after having been identified by a witness and failing to make his case in court. However, all of this was prior to the existence of DNA testing. 18 years into his sentence, pubic hairs held as evidence in the case were tested for DNA, and Steven Avery's was not present. Although this information does not have anything to do with the death of Teresa Halbach, it is important information in understanding the argument presented by the defense. And that argument is that while bone fragments and other supposed evidence was found on the Avery property, Steven Avery did not kill Teresa Halbach, nor did he have anything to do with her death. But the Manitowoc County Police Force was laser focused on making sure Steven Avery went down for the crime and planted evidence to incriminate him. The defense makes it clear that they are not accusing the police of murdering someone in order to take Steven Avery down, nor are they suggesting they know who the killer was. But because the police were sure of Steven Avery's guilt, they planted the evidence in order to ensure a conviction. On the surface, there doesn't really seem to be a connection between the 1985 rape case and the Halbach case. But Avery was in the process of filing a wrongful conviction lawsuit against the Manitowoc Sheriff's Department when this case began to be investigated. And the argument is that the lawsuit put the police department in a situation in which they would have had to pay a large sum of money to Avery in order to settle the suit, which they likely could not afford. But also, as the docuseries explains, the Averys aren't seen as good upstanding citizens. From what I understood, they aren't seen as criminals, just kind of oddballs and troublemakers. And because of that, the police might have been upset that they were being taken down by the likes of Steven Avery. So, as the defense stated, no one thinks the police killed anyone and framed Steven Avery for it. But it would have been a huge incentive for the department if Steven Avery had been the guilty party, and the circumstances surrounding the death of Teresa Halbach were just too convenient for them to pass up the opportunity to make sure Steven Avery went to prison for it, despite all of the evidence suggesting that he might not have done it. Now, obviously, the prosecutors claim that this is just an insane theory, and while the docuseries doesn't do a great job of relaying the case the prosecutors put forward, it is a convincing enough story for people to question whether or not there was some kind of corruption involved. I'll let you watch the docuseries to determine exactly what you think happened in the case. I'm not going to go into exhaustive detail about the facts of the case against Steven Avery, because that's not really what I'm here to talk about. I, for one, do have my doubts about Steven Avery having committed this crime. I can't say for certain that I believe he's innocent because I don't have all of the facts and I haven't sufficiently heard what the prosecutors argued in court that led to the guilty verdict. But I will say that the evidence presented by the defense throughout the series was incredibly convincing, and everything that has come out since the case under Avery's new attorney, Kathleen Zellner, has been just as convincing. And I do think it would have been difficult for the defense to prove a case of police corruption in such a conservative area. But if Steven Avery didn't kill Teresa Halbach, who did? Unfortunately, I don't think we'll ever truly know what happened to Teresa, as so much time has passed, evidence has been tainted or destroyed, and some of the suspected killers are themselves dead. but that hasn't stopped people from theorizing about what could have happened. So today, I'm going to talk about those theories. Keep in mind, several of these theories come from armchair detectives and probably do not have much merit. However, some of these theories have been presented by experts and even Avery's own defense attorney. But before I delve into these theories, I want to explain something that's relevant to all of them. In order for any of these theories to work, you have to accept that police intentionally framed Stephen Avery. Each of these theories is framed in such a way that the events of that night led to conditions found and manipulated by the police in order to pin it on Stephen Avery. Whether that truly happened or not, I don't know. But I think the docuseries presents a convincing enough case to have some suspicions, and it's worth not looking past the accusations entirely. So that being said, the first theory I want to talk about is about a man simply referred to as the German. Honestly, I'm not sure what his actual name is, and he may not have even actually existed. But this is an interesting theory, and as far as I could find, one of the oldest theories about the case. I've seen some reports that the man's last name is actually German, where some reports say he is from German descent. And the fact that we can't even pin down a name here sort of leads me to believe that this is just a story someone made up, but the original posts no longer exist, so it's possible that I just couldn't find all of the information. Anyway, the German was assumably around the same age as Avery and suffered from some sort of psychosis. The allegations about the German's involvement supposedly came from his estranged wife, who lived right outside of the Avery property at the time of Teresa Halbach's murder. This woman, whose name we also don't have, claimed that the German was erratic, sometimes violent, and obsessed with fire. In the entirety of her story, she says she discovers that her husband had done a few things, but it's not clear how much she actually witnessed. She claims that on the day of the murder, which was Halloween night in 2005, she discovers that the German had visited her home, which she was apparently renting. She says, quote, "He visited the Maribel area and had stopped at the rental before the lease began. He spoke of visiting an auto salvage yard. He commented that a woman wanted to take pictures of the rental property, and he felt the photographer was stupid." Again, this story might feel confusing because I don't have the original post to reference, so I'm not super clear on how she discovered this information or if he told all of this to her in the following days. I want to assume that's the case, but she also claims to have been estranged from him at the time of the murder, but for the purposes of explaining this theory, I'm going to continue with the assumption that this was the case. The woman then goes on to claim that she discovered her husband, quote, had scratches on his back and a cut finger that bled intermittently. This was presumably after the conversation she had with him regarding the rental property. Sometime later, the woman and her husband came across a missing persons flyer with Teresa Halbach's photo on it. Supposedly, the German remarked that Teresa was dead upon seeing it. Understandably so, this struck the woman as an odd statement and began to form some suspicions of her husband. However, it's also possible that the man was just stating a presumption based on how he perceives missing persons cases, assuming that she was probably already dead. She doesn't mention anything about asking him what he meant or having any kind of conversation about that statement, so we just kind of have to form our own opinions on what he probably meant by that. At some point in the following month, the woman also claims that she discovered a number of suspicious items in the German's home. Now, this is where I lose faith in this theory, but I'll let you decide how convincing it is. Among the items found in his home were bloody women's panties, fresh bones, a can of lighter fluid with bloody fingerprints on it, a mason's hammer covered in dark red flecks, graphic pornographic magazines, and surgical gloves. Supposedly, the woman contacted the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department and reported her findings, but was told that all of Teresa Halbach's clothing had been accounted for, and that the panties she found likely belonged to a child. However, while the woman didn't seem to push the issue, she was still convinced that her husband had something to do with Teresa's murder. I think this theory is an interesting one, and there are a lot of people online who believe this is what really happened. However, I can't seem to find anything that legitimately corroborates anything in this story. If any of this had actually happened, even if the bloody clothing the woman found was determined not to be related to Teresa Halbach, there would probably have been an arrest or at the very least an investigation into the German. And having this theory linked to the infamy of the Stephen Avery case, I don't think it would have been hard to find articles linking the investigation to the Avery case. But not only can I not find anything that suggests there was an investigation into the discovery of these items, I can't even find where anything was reported to the Manitowoc County Police about any of this. And again, the fact that we don't know these people's names is enough for me to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the story. I think it's just a little too convenient, and there's not enough confirmed factual information for this to be true. But that doesn't mean it's not. It's entirely possible that I just wasn't looking in the right place for my information. but there are other theories that feel a little bit more legitimate to me, so let's talk about those and you can decide what you think is true. This next big theory I'm a little bit reluctant to mention because while there are some suspicious details here, I think it's probably a reach, and it's probably not fair to the Halbach family to speculate about this. But I'm far from the first person to speak about this theory, and parts of it stem from the docuseries itself. In part 2 of the series, Stephen's new attorney, Kathleen Zellner, makes some observations about Teresa's ex-boyfriend, Ryan Hillegas, and claims that she believes he, at the very least, went along with the police officer's attempt to frame Stephen. And honestly, based on the evidence presented, I think it's highly likely that this is true. It seems clear that this was a case of tunnel vision for the police, and they likely convinced the Halbach family that Stephen Avery was guilty, and they wanted to help put him away however they possibly could. So Kathleen Zellner's argument is that Ryan had Teresa's day planner, and that it was used as evidence in the case to show what her itinerary for that day would have been. But how would Ryan have gotten a hold of it? He claims it was just printed off of the computer, where she had it organized on Outlook or some similar program. And that's true, but there were also things handwritten on the document that she would have had to have planned on the day of the murder. And if Teresa was last seen at the Avery property, then it would still have been in her car. And the only way they could have gotten the planner is if they had access to the car. Now, if the police had claimed they found the planner in the car, it would have been a totally different story. But that's not what happened. Ryan presented the planner. So that's odd in and of itself, but it doesn't exactly link Ryan to the actual murder, only to the possibility that he may have helped police relocate the car in order to frame Stephen. So that's odd in and of itself, but it doesn't exactly link Ryan to the actual murder, only to the possibility that he may have helped police relocate the car in order to frame Stephen. But the big reason this is brought up is because, especially as Teresa's ex-boyfriend, Ryan Hillegas should have been considered a suspect in the case, and Zellner argues that he was not seriously considered, and neither were any of the other viable suspects, and that should be grounds for a new trial. So that's sort of the background here, and nothing more is alleged in the docuseries or by Zellner in general to link Ryan Hillegas to the murder. But some people don't believe this is where his involvement ended, or rather where it began. There are several things to consider here, and here are some of the big ones. First, there were reports that Ryan was verbally and physically abusive of Teresa during their relationship. This is actually brought up in the legal brief compiled by Kathleen Zellner, and the claim was made by a man by the name of Thomas Pierce, for whom Teresa had interned in 2003. While he did not specifically name Ryan in his affidavit, he did confirm a date range of when the abusive relationship would have occurred, and it was the same time she was involved with Ryan. Second, Ryan had sustained visible injuries to his hands around the time of Teresa's disappearance, and they appeared to be fingernail scratches. He also had no alibi for the date of the murder for the days following, nor was he asked by police to provide one. His phone records also show significant gaps during the periods of time that the murder was supposedly committed, and during the times they suspect the body was burned and evidence was tampered with. Third, Ryan was not only living in Teresa's house and had access to all of the evidence from the home that was turned over to the police, but internet sleuths claim that he initially gave the police a false name and minimized his relationship with her. Now, why would he feel the need to do that if he wasn't involved? That's suspicious enough for me to consider this theory as valid. However, I couldn't find any indication of this in Kathleen Zellner's brief, and I think if it were true, there's no way she would have excluded it. But there are plenty of other claims in the report that show he was intentionally deceitful with the police. The documentary talks a little bit about how there was some damage done to Teresa's vehicle. The driver's side bumper had some damage, and the parking light on that side was also broken. Ryan told the police that this took place months before the murder and that Teresa had filed an insurance claim on the damage. But post-conviction investigators have determined that this was a complete lie. It appears that the damage to the vehicle was determined to have occurred after the vehicle left the Avery property. Kathleen does make reference to specific evidence in her brief about how the investigators came to this conclusion, but I don't know what that evidence is, so it's a little unclear as to how they determined that. I assume it's related to the theory presented in the docuseries about someone having to have backed the car into the Avery property, pushing another vehicle out of the way in order to plant it to be found by the search party on the Avery property, but I can't be certain on that. Now, that's not enough information to confirm that what Ryan said to the police about the car damage was a lie, but it turns out Teresa also never filed an insurance claim on the vehicle either. Again, it's possible she told Ryan she had and never actually did, and generally, you file an insurance claim to cover the cost of a repair, so the fact that the damage was still present should have been an indicator that no insurance claim was ever filed. But that's not all. Ryan also admitted to having access to Teresa's voicemail. He claims that he was searching for evidence, maybe a missed call that would lead them to a suspect. He also claimed that he guessed her username and password, but that's incredibly unlikely. Kathleen says in her brief that it's evident that he had knowledge of Teresa's username and password and always had access to her account, as he was able to request her phone records. And if he accessed her voicemail, it's entirely possible that he could have deleted important evidence, perhaps an incriminating voicemail he left for her. Kathleen also makes note of a relationship Teresa was having with a former client by the name of Mr. Check, of which Ryan was aware and of which he seemingly did not approve. We know that he was at least aware of the relationship because he contacted Mr. Check directly from his own mobile device after the murder. Mr. Check was never considered a suspect in this case by police or the defense because he was very straightforward with the investigators and they were able to corroborate everything he told them. She also states that Ryan continued to have some sort of sexual interest in Teresa after their breakup that Teresa didn't reciprocate. So while this isn't really hard evidence, it leaves us with reason to suspect that he might have been jealous of the relationship Teresa had with Mr. Check, and that could have been motive enough to commit the murder. Kathleen makes a large number of allegations against Ryan in her brief, but none of it is meant to actually claim that Ryan committed the murder. The intention was only to prove that he was not looked at as a suspect, but absolutely should have been, and therefore the case against Stephen wasn't fairly investigated. But even though Kathleen isn't alleging that Ryan killed Teresa, does it sound possible that he could have? Some people go even further in their accusations, claiming that Teresa's brother Mike also had something to do with the murder. This is mostly based on observations made on his demeanor and the answers he gave in interviews with the media. But the idea here is that Mike actually hated Teresa and worked with Ryan to help kill her. And that's why, even with the lack of evidentiary knowledge, Mike was so adamant that Stephen and Brendan killed Teresa. The Brendan Dassey confession is a whole other story, but Mike claims in an interview that he didn't even watch the interrogation of Brendan. And even though Stephen was convicted on a story that completely dismisses Brendan's confession, Mike has remained steadfast in his opinion that Stephen and Brendan were the killers. I don't find that completely odd, honestly. I think that if a family member were murdered, you would have no reason not to trust what the police were telling you they knew to be true. And you might not want to put yourself through the torment of watching the interrogation of the person being charged with your sister's murder. But with the circumstances surrounding Ryan and the seemingly odd media interactions with both Ryan and Mike, it does cast some suspicion in their direction. Personally, I don't think there's anything to this. I think Ryan, Mike, and the entire Halbach family have faced enough with Teresa's murder, and this is just adding insult to injury. However, I do believe that Ryan Hillegas worked with the police during the investigation of the murder to plant evidence and ensure that Stephen went to prison for the crime. But again, I don't think this was done in an attempt to divert attention away from themselves or anyone else, but to make up for the lack of evidence they could present for a conviction of a man they were sure committed the crime. There are a few other theories out there I don't think make a whole lot of sense, but I'll give them a brief mention here. Now, we know that the alleged conspiracy here is that the police framed Stephen because of the multi-million-dollar lawsuit he had against them for his previous wrongful conviction, along with the suspicions that they had just wanted to put him away because they saw him as some sort of lowlife. Some people, though, think the police are actually responsible for Teresa's death, not just planting the evidence. Specifically, they blame Officer Colburn and Lieutenant Link for the murder. It seems most of the suspicion is derived from the circumstances surrounding the clear evidence that they tampered with case evidence. And while that is, in fact, suspicious, I think it's a stretch to say they planned an entire murder in order to get back at Stephen Avery. More likely is that they took advantage of a murder that took place in order to frame Stephen, and I can't see how any evidence from this case can point you in a direction beyond that. Some people also think Teresa wasn't murdered at all, but that she committed suicide. I think this is an interesting perspective, but ultimately probably unlikely. This theory is derived from the video diary she created as a part of a school project in which she talks about what she would like her legacy to be if she were to die. They also note that when Teresa was reported missing, she was listed as missing endangered as opposed to just missing, which could point to her being depressed and possibly suicidal. So the thought then is that Officer Colburn stumbled upon her vehicle on the side of the road, found her dead inside, and manipulated the situation to make it look like a murder had occurred. This would explain the odd call Officer Colburn made checking on the vehicle's license plate number before the car had even been recovered. And there are other problems here. One being, how did she kill herself? Truthfully, they don't know what the cause of death was. They assume it was due to a gunshot wound to the head due to the skull fragments found with evidence of a bullet entrance. And that's plausible to assume, but it doesn't mean that's how she died. She could have strangled herself with her seatbelt, she could have downed a bottle of pills, she could have even shot herself in the head. but there's just no evidence of any of that. There wasn't enough blood in the car to suggest she shot herself. There was no evidence of any other type of suicide in the vehicle, and even if you want to argue that it could have taken place outside the vehicle, all of the attorneys involved, including the post-conviction defense team and the original defense team, all agree that Teresa was murdered. Not a single person presented a case that claimed she could have committed suicide. So while it does make some sense that this could be a plausible scenario, it doesn't seem likely that this is what happened. And along the lines of people believing Teresa wasn't murdered, there are also people out there who believe that the whole thing was staged and that Teresa is actually still alive somewhere. I can't get behind this one at all. It's just too far-fetched for me. But the theory here is that police made a proposition with Teresa to go into hiding in order to set this elaborate scheme up that she actually had been murdered and that Stephen Avery should go to jail for the crime. Now, that's a story that could follow since they were embarrassed by his release from prison and probably could not afford to pay him the millions he was trying to get out of them. So they needed a scenario, and when one didn't exist, they created one. But it's just too unrealistic to me that they would go to those extremes. First of all, there would be way too much risk of her being discovered as alive, even if it was years down the road. It just wouldn't make sense to risk that. But also, the only motivation I could see for anyone in Teresa's position to accept a proposition like this would be a vast sum of money. And if they couldn't afford to pay Stephen, then how were they going to afford to pay Teresa to go into hiding? Some people think they offered her a substantial sum that was far less than what Stephen was seeking, but still enough for her to live comfortably wherever she wanted. And some people think they could afford to pay Stephen, but didn't think he deserved the money. So they gave it to Teresa instead, and put this mess of a plan in place to frame him. But that just seems so unreasonable to me, and there isn't even any evidence of that amount of money being moved anywhere. I could be wrong, but I don't know if a local police department would have the ability to hide a transfer of millions of dollars to a private citizen, especially since police are public sector employees. The next theory I want to talk about is, in my opinion, the most credible. This one is also presented by Kathleen Zellner in the second part of the docuseries. If you watched the show, you're probably pretty familiar with this theory, and you also know that it was met with a lot of anger and criticism from the Dassey family, as it alleges that even though Stephen and Brendan had nothing to do with Teresa's death, Brendan's brother Bobby and their mother's husband Scott Toddick were the actual killers. I don't feel a huge need to delve too far into this one, as the docuseries covers it quite well, and I assume that if you're listening to this, you're probably familiar with the case through having watched the show. But the gist of the theory is that Bobby Dassey was a star witness for the prosecutors because he was the only eyewitness to see Teresa's comings and goings from the property that day. He and Scott Toddick were both planning to go hunting that day, and they were each other's only alibis. Of course, they were never really considered suspects in the case, so an official alibi was never demanded from them. And they weren't planning to go hunting together, it just so happens that they planned separately to go at the same time and passed each other on the road on their way to their individual destinations. But they do corroborate each other's stories, although it seems that their stories have been inconsistent. During the original trial, it was discovered that Bobby Dassey had searched for some questionable content using the family computer. There's quite a list of what he actually searched, and it's pretty gross. So instead of going into detail, I'll just say that it was graphic, pornographic in nature, and often included violence or death. But this information was never provided to the defense, which is a Brady violation, which means it was evidence pertinent to the case that should have been disclosed and wasn't, and could have changed the outcome of the trial. And that's the basis for Kathleen to bring this up, because again, right now she's looking for post-conviction relief by showing that there was evidence that wasn't considered and there were other suspects that should have been investigated. But while she may not be outright saying Bobby and Scott were the murderers, she does make a pretty compelling case for why they might have actually done it. In the show, Kathleen talks a little bit about her theory. It starts with a signed affidavit from another Dassey brother, Brian, who completely undermines Bobby's trial testimony. In his statement, Brian says that Teresa was only on the Avery property for about 5 minutes, where she took pictures of the vehicle for sale and left. He also says that Bobby saw Teresa leave, and therefore his trial testimony stating he never saw her leave was untrue. Not to mention that Bobby has gone back and forth on this detail several times over the years, while Brian has consistently given the same story time and time again. Brian also mentions that his uncle and brother-in-law went hunting rabbits at the back of the Avery property on November 2nd, 2 days after the alleged date of the murder, and Teresa's car was not back there where they found it in the following days. Another important detail here is that when investigators were looking for Teresa's body, they brought cadaver dogs out to the area who alerted to an area off of the side of the road that looked to be an area with some overgrown foliage and whatnot. The police initially dismissed this as nothing was found in the area, but Kathleen's argument stems from a combination of all of this information. Her theory is that Bobby watched Teresa leave the Avery property and followed her for some time in his own vehicle. At some point, he flags her down and claims he wants her to photograph his vehicle. From there, a lot of different theories circulate. It's not clear what exactly happened at that point to Teresa, but obviously the point Kathleen is getting at is that Bobby wanted to act out one of his deviant sexual fantasies on Teresa and ultimately killed her. And the theory then is that the area where the cadaver dogs had alerted is where the car and the body must have remained for long enough for the scent to still be present for the dogs to find before the car was moved to the Avery property to frame Stephen. Scott's accounts were also proven to have been untrue from that day, as he claims to have been visiting his mother in Green Bay, but he wasn't in Green Bay that day, and Stephen claims to have seen his vehicle at the Dassey residence at noon on that day. Kathleen believes the two of them worked together to kill Teresa, or at the very least to dispose of the body. Since the release of the show, Kathleen has also stated they have done further investigating into the Dasseys, and their evidentiary briefs have forced the police to do some investigation as well. According to Kathleen, she says that she believes a huge part of this story did take place in a garage, but it was the Dassey garage that was involved, not Stephen's garage. I didn't see anywhere where she went into detail about this, but in the docuseries she speaks about the advantages someone who hunts deer might have about the knowledge of how to cut up a body. So I assume that's what they're alleging took place in the garage before they took her to the quarry to burn the body. And to make this even more interesting, apparently when they showed up to investigate, Bobby went out and hung a deer to dress in the garage, seemingly in an attempt to try and hinder the investigators' attempts to discover evidence. Now that much is just speculation, but there does seem to be some developments in the case surrounding Bobby Dassey and Scott Todick happening now, so it would be interesting to see what comes of that. I have one more theory I want to talk about. I hadn't heard this one until recently, although I believe it may have been circulating for some time, but it was such an interesting theory alleged by someone with a somewhat high profile, it drew me into finding out what other theories exist surrounding the case. Essentially, this theory is what is responsible for this episode. I can't say that I'm fully convinced about this, but it's interesting enough to consider. This theory is alleged by a man by the name of John Cameron, a retired police detective who worked specifically on cold cases during his career. Mr. Cameron has worked some pretty high-profile cases in his time, and even assisted the FBI in catching a ritualistic child cannibal by the name of Nathan Bar Jonah. Since retirement, he has investigated the murders of a single serial killer by the name of Edward Wayne Edwards, convinced that the man committed far more many murders than just the ones for which he was held responsible. And, you guessed it, one of those murders he believes Edwards committed was Teresa Halbach's. If you're not familiar with Edward Wayne Edwards, I would highly suggest you look him up. Essentially, he was a notorious serial killer who was arrested and convicted of brutally killing 5 people, although he is believed to have been responsible for more, but claimed to be responsible for several killings to which he can't realistically be connected, such as the Zodiac murders and the murder of John Benet Ramsey. Cameron has tried to make the connection to several different murders, but it does not appear that his theories are ultimately taken too seriously by other professionals, so make of that what you will. According to Cameron, Edwards would have been living in Wisconsin at the time of the murder, and not too terribly far from where the Averys lived. Edwards was known to get some sort of satisfaction from pinning his murders on other people and following the cases until the end. Having recently seen the news of Stephen Avery being released from prison over a wrongful conviction, he decided to set his sights on him. Now, Edwards died in 2011 at the age of 77, which would have made him 72 when Teresa was killed. That seems pretty old for someone to have been actively committing murders like that, but Cameron does not believe that this is the case, and in fact claims that he may have used his age to his advantage. He believes that on the day of the murder, he hid out of sight around the Avery property and waited for Teresa to leave. Once she left, he flagged her down on the side of the road. Cameron believes that she slowed down to try and help him because at the age of 72, she just perceived him as an old harmless man. However, once she pulled over, Cameron believes he walked up to the driver's side of the car, shot Teresa in the left temple, pushed her to the passenger seat of the car, shot her again in the back of the head, and drove her car to the quarry to burn the body. He then disposed of the car on the Avery property. Then, when the search party formed, Cameron believes Edward joined the search party and might have suggested to Ryan Hillegas and Pam Stern, the woman who eventually found the vehicle, that the salvage yard be checked just in case, since all of those cars were out there, leading them to check in that region where he had planted the vehicle. Cameron claims that Edwards would have followed the case closely afterwards, even using an assumed name to watch the trial at the courthouse. He even believes you can see Edwards at the courthouse in the docuseries. In part 1, episode 6, about 12 minutes into the episode, there is a scene in which Ken Kratz, the prosecutor in the case, is giving an interview with the media, and a man who looks suspiciously like Edwards is standing behind him in the doorway. You can look up pictures of this scene, and honestly it's a little hard to tell if that's actually him or not, but it does admittedly look like him a little bit. And Cameron says that to this day, he cannot confirm who that person was if not Edwards. I have seen some claims that it's actually just Stephen's father, and it's hard to tell who it is because it's so blurry. But I don't know, I don't think it looks like Stephen's dad. I don't mean to say that I think it's actually Edwards, but it is an interesting perspective on the story and would certainly be a huge twist in the case. Cameron's website is full of theories like this, though, and he has tried to connect Edwards to so many different cases at this point, it's sort of become unbelievable. I'll put a link to his website in the show notes, though, in case anyone wants to read what he has to say. So those are the theories that I have for you about the murder of Teresa Halbach. What do you think happened to her? Do you think any of these theories are valid, or do you think there's another story that still needs to be considered? Or is it possible that Steve and Avery committed the murder and there really isn't any true conspiracy going on here? If you like this episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. And don't forget to check out my social media pages. You can find me on Facebook at So You Want Me to Believe Podcast, and on Twitter and Instagram with the handle at SYWMTBpod on both platforms. Also, if you have an idea for a new episode or would like to share any feedback or case opinions, please feel free to send me an email at sywmtbpod@gmail.com. And finally, please check out the link tree in the show notes in order to find links to my Patreon page, my web store, and links to all of the platforms where you can listen to the show. As always, thank you for listening, and I will see you again next time.